My name is Sara Seweid-DeAngelis. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm 29 years old, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities.
How did you discover the fellowship?
Through social media, but specifically through Caitlin. Her and I were in the same program for grad school, and so she was circulating that on social media and stuff, and I applied because of that.
Okay, so what kind of work do you do in the fellowship?
So this summer I am working to produce 2 podcasts that will be used as part of an open access educational materials.
And what are the topics of your podcast?
So I decided to do the topic of gender violence in Egypt. And so the first podcast will be looking at how the state uses instances of gendered violence to increase surveillance and policing as like a carceral state. And the second one kind of builds on the first podcast. Some of the same themes are present in my second podcast, but the second one looks specifically at how gendered violence against women is central to the carceral state in Egypt, and how queer bodies are punished through incarceration in Egypt.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. What are your personal goals for this fellowship, and what about the future?
So this fellowship, I think it's really great that it allows me to learn like new skills that are not really part of my academic training. Kind of working with audio and like working to create a podcast. It's not something that I ever learned to do or really even considered doing before this fellowship. So it's nice because I get to do that this summer. And I'm also really drawn to the idea of creating open access educational materials that could be used in classrooms and high schools and undergraduate courses. I think that it just makes learning more accessible, which I'm very passionate about.
Okay, thank you. Is there any information about your area of interest or research that you wouldn't normally bring up but piques your interest?
So, my research before this fellowship, part of my dissertation, is very different from what I'm doing this summer. And so, my research definitely is interested in gender and race. But for my research outside of this program, I look at beauty and notions of beauty and how those are racialized in Egypt from a historical standpoint. And so in a strange way, the work that I'm doing this summer is kind of outside the scope of that, which I love. Fellowship, it allowed me to kind of delve into research and areas of interest that I typically didn't have the space to think about because dissertation research is so consuming. I like that I got to step away from that and do research on femicide and gender violence and things that are more contemporary in Egypt. So yeah.
Thank you for explaining that. So why are you focusing on Egypt specifically, and how are the conditions regarding race, gender, and beauty different from the US?
So, I've always been drawn to Egypt because I was born in Egypt. I grew up there for a good amount of years. And so, a lot of the drive for me is motivated by wanting to answer questions for myself. Having this question mark around certain topics, around race and beauty and gender, and wanting to get to the bottom of it, And so, that's why I look at Egypt. But studying Egypt, I've realized, especially in the context of beauty and stuff, I've realized a lot of overlap with other places like Brazil, for example, which is really interesting because they're in very different places. They have different socio-historical histories, but the thing that kind of ties Brazil, for example, and Egypt is the history of slavery. And so, I guess to answer your question about how it's similar to the US as well, in places where there was a history of slavery, you can see that there are legacies of slavery that persist after slavery is abolished. And these things kind of come up in understandings of beauty, understandings of desire, and even gender, right? Ideas of ideal womanhood are shaped by longer legacies of slavery and colonialism. And so my research kind of explores that.
You kind of like touched base on this a little bit, but why focus on post-colonial versus colonial Egypt?
So, I mentioned this a little bit, but kind of the legacies of these big events, let's call them that happened in history, like slavery or colonialism, they don't just disappear once, you sign the law abolishing slavery, or, a nation is, officially independent from colonial rule. There's legacies of that remain. And so one of the things that I'm interested in seeing is how some of these ideas kind of remained unchanged from colonial era Egypt to post-colonial Egypt, and how they transformed over time, and if that transformation was sufficient in kind of addressing some of these ideas that originated through coloniality, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the motivation for studying both eras.
Could you go into more detail about what you mean by transformation? Do you mean like just society-wise, or just like structure-wise? Or I was just curious when you said that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, for example, like ideas that emerged during colonial times, let's say around beauty, that fair skin is ideal and desirable, right? So kind of tracing that through the different time periods to see if colonialism influenced these ideas, which we know that they have, right? A lot of scholars have already done that research. And so seeing let's say a place has decolonized, it is no longer under British rule, Egypt, for example. So kind of seeing if the idea that fair skin is hailed as ideal and it doesn't reflect what Egyptians actually look like. Has there been a transformation there? Because colonialism is no longer here, but these ideas that emerged through colonialism still exist. So what, kind of seeing the tensions there, and the underlying reasons why these ideas exist in the first place, right? And maybe it's not entirely colonialism that's responsible for these ideas, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to kind of dig deeper into that and seeing how these ideas got there in the first place, and how they changed over time.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. What is femicide in your own words?
So femicide is the death of women as a result of gendered violence, which includes murder, right, like homicide, but it also includes suicide as a result of, as an attempt to escape gendered violence, or as a result of gendered violence. So femicide is complex because it's not just the act of killing someone, which, scholars have covered this, the distinction between homicide and femicide. But I also think that, because gendered violence is at the core of the motivation for this death, it also includes suicide, which happens actually kind of often in Egypt. There are many cases of young girls and women committing suicide to escape their conditions, which have been, dealing with extreme gendered violence and misogyny. And so, that's just kind of how I define it.
Okay, thank you. I remember you noting suicide especially as well, and that was very significant to me. I know one of your projects you mentioned focusing on, I think, Sara Hegazi. Could you give a little explanation about why you chose to focus on her, and a little bit of background on her story?
Yeah, so Sara Hegazi was a queer activist who was arrested in Egypt. She's originally an Egyptian woman. She was arrested in 2017 after attending a Mashroua Leila concert. It's this popular indie Lebanese band. and the main singer of the band is openly gay. And so, Sarah at the time, I don't know if she was out to everyone in her life, but at the time, she waved a rainbow flag along with other attendees of the concert, and pictures of that were captured, and they circulated online, and they were taken by state media people to slander and smear all the attendees in a very homophobic way. And so she actually ended up getting arrested because of that, and she was tortured in prison. She was in prison for about 3 months, and after she got out, she sought asylum and was granted asylum in Canada. And she was really tormented by her experience in prison. She kept a diary in prison. And these writings are now online, but through her writings you see the extreme violence that she was, both emotional, physical, mental, violence that she was going through. And in 2020, June 2020, she actually ended her life. She could no longer bear the aftermath of the trauma that she experienced in prison. And so I guess when I talk about femicide, including people who commit suicide as a result of gendered violence, I think of people like Sara Hegazi, because she did take her own life, but it was because of extreme gendered and sexual violence that she experienced because of her queer identity. And so because my work this summer is looking at the carceral state, I'm interested in seeing how queer bodies are deemed as unruly by the Egyptian state, and how they're punished and are impacted by the carceral logics that kind of proliferate in Egypt, if that makes sense.
Would you say the treatment of people who are heteronormative, who are not male, especially, are significantly better than those who don't conform to I don't want to say normality, but I guess that's considered within a society there is what is quote unquote the golden standard?
Right, and I feel that's a good question. So I think it's interesting because there isn't a concrete definition of what is normative in one place. It's constantly changing, and I think there is an effort right now to present, for the Egyptian regime to present itself as pro-women, which is really ironic because it's but it presents itself as pro-women by being we have women in parliament, we have women in high ranking offices and things like that. Certain kinds of women are deemed as normative and can be incorporated into the state, but then you have other women who can be gay, who can be disabled in some instances, women who are political activists who might voice their opinions about police brutality, for example. And these are people who the state deems as non-normative and should be punished for either their gendered identity, their sexual identity, their political views, their disabilities. But I do think it affects men as well, especially if they're non-straight, if they're gender non-conforming, but male-presenting. I hope that answers your question, but I think it's kind of all over the place, but that's just kind of the gist of it.
What value does oral history or storytelling have with analyzing the conditions of a state?
History essentially is a story, right? I don't think we're taught to think about history in that way, but history is telling the story of the past. And so many times it's told in a very boring way, which I think, happens deliberately to keep people from analyzing the past or looking to the past to make sense of the present or even the future. But I think what oral history or storytelling do so powerfully is they allow you to create a exciting story, to tell an exciting story from the point of view of a person, which I think is really crucial because we don't think of the people of the past, I think, generally when we think of history. But I think bringing it to an individual level through storytelling, through oral history, allows you to get a glimpse of how an individual or a community experienced a specific moment in history. And it adds a personal element to that, which I think allows people to feel more connected to the history that's being told or narrated. And so I think it's really a really powerful tool that can allow us all to learn more from the past.